They said they wanted to tax the rich. They said the billionaire class had too much power. They said the system was rigged. Then they voted for the billionaire. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of the biggest con job in American history, and it all started with a man named James. James lived in a small town in Ohio, a place where the factory whistle once called the shots for the entire community. The factory where he worked for over 2 decades, the one that had employed his father and grandfather, was the beating heart of everything. It provided not just jobs, but identity, purpose, and a future that stretched out predictably, if not brilliantly, before the next generation. James had raised his 2 kids with the steady paycheck, put them through high school, maybe a little community college, and planned for a modest but secure retirement. He wasn't rich, but he wasn't poor either. He was solid, middle class, American. Then the factory closed. Not gradually, not with warning, but overnight. A memo on the break room wall, a final paycheck, and a locked door. The company had moved operations overseas where labor was cheaper, regulations less stringent, and profit margins wider. James, along with 800 other workers, found himself on the street. The severance was minimal. The pension, he later learned through a convoluted legal process, was underfunded and largely vapor. His 401k, which had seemed like a solid nest egg, had been heavily invested in company stock. It was worth a fraction of its former value. The town, once bustling, began to hollow out. The diner closed. The barber shop, the small hardware store where James had bought supplies for weekend projects. Empty storefronts stared out like missing teeth. This wasn't just an economic event for James. It was a personal betrayal. He had played by the rules. He had worked hard, stayed loyal, saved a little, and believed in the American dream. The promise that hard work would be rewarded, that the system, while not perfect, was fundamentally fair, had been shattered. He watched as the executives who had orchestrated the closure moved on to bigger, better jobs in gleaming towers, their golden parachutes intact. The free market had worked for them, just not for him. He felt forgotten, abandoned by the very institutions he had trusted. James began to pay attention to politics. He followed the news, not with the casual interest of his pre-factory closing days, but with the desperate hunger of a man who felt his world slipping away. He saw the stock market soaring to record highs, even as people like him struggled. He saw politicians in Washington, D.C., speaking in terms that felt foreign, using words like austerity and global competitiveness to justify what felt like a theft of his future. He saw the wealthy getting tax breaks while schools in his town closed due to budget cuts. The anger that had been simmering since the factory closure began to boil over. He wanted someone to fight for people like him, not for the system that had failed him. He looked at the usual suspects. The Republican candidates, the ones from the traditional party of business, and the wealthy. They spoke of free markets, of job creators, of reducing regulations. It sounded good in theory, but James had just lived through the harsh reality of an unregulated market. The regulations they wanted to cut were the very things that had protected his pension, his workplace safety, his health. The job creators were the ones who had destroyed his job. The wealthy, the ones they constantly worried about not burdening with taxes, were the ones who seemed to be getting richer while he got poorer. He didn't trust them. Then came the promise. A man who said he understood, who said he was different, who spoke in the same language of anger and betrayal that James felt in his gut. This man wasn't from the country club. He didn't talk about incentives for the wealthy. He talked about draining the swamp. He talked about the forgotten man. He talked about fighting the other guy, the establishment, the elites, the ones who had made the deals that sent James' job overseas. He was loud, brash, and unpolished in a way that felt authentic, like the guy next door who'd finally had enough and decided to tell the whole world off. He promised to bring back the jobs, to make America great again, to fight for the working man. He promised to tax the rich, just not the right kind of rich. James wasn't alone in his anger. Across the country, similar stories played out. In the Rust Belt, the old manufacturing towns that had been the backbone of American industry watched their factories disappear. In rural areas, small farmers struggled with trade wars and tariffs that seemed to hurt them more than the large agribusinesses they were supposedly protecting. In small cities, Main Street businesses closed as Amazon and other big retailers dominated the market. The common thread was a feeling of economic displacement, a sense that the rules of the game had changed and not in their favor. These were people who had bought into the American dream. They had worked hard, often in physically demanding or monotonous jobs, for modest pay and basic benefits. They had saved what they could, maybe bought a house, maybe sent a kid to college. They weren't asking for much, just a stable life, a chance to provide for their families, and a secure future for their children. They had often voted Republican, believing in the values of hard work, self-reliance, and limited government. But the Republican Party, as represented by its traditional leadership, seemed to have forgotten them. It seemed to cater to the wealthy donors, the corporate interests, the urban professionals. It seemed to speak a language of tax cuts for the rich and deregulation for the powerful, while offering little concrete help for the working stiff. Enter the con man, the one who promised to be different. He didn't talk like the usual Republican candidates. He didn't wear the costume of the country club. He wore the costume of the common man, even though he was anything but common. His wealth was astronomical, his lifestyle gaudy, his history one of leveraging other people's money and connections to build his empire. But he played the part. He railed against globalism. He promised to bring back American jobs. He spoke of winning and making deals. He didn't promise tax cuts for the wealthy. He promised to fight the wealthy who were the problem, the ones in the establishment, the ones in Washington, the ones who looked down on people like James. The contrast was stark. On one side, the traditional Republican establishment, polished, educated, speaking in measured tones about economic policy and fiscal responsibility. On the other side, the populist billionaire, loud, brash, speaking in emotional terms about betrayal and forgotten Americans. James, and millions like him, saw the traditional Republicans as the problem. They were the party of the rich, of the system that had failed him. The populist billionaire offered a different narrative. He was the outsider, the one who would shake up the system, the one who would fight for the forgotten. The traditional Republican message of lower taxes, less regulation, felt hollow to James. He had watched his taxes go down for the wealthy while his own costs, healthcare, education, housing went up. He had watched regulations disappear that he needed environmental protections, financial oversight, labor rights. The promise of more of the same felt like more of the same failure. The populist billionaire offered something different, a promise to fight, to take on the system, to make it work for him again. The con man's strategy wasn't new. It was an old trick, as old as politics itself. Pit the working class against each other, against immigrants, against minorities, against liberal elites, while the actual architects of their economic hardship remained untouched. The populist billionaire was a master of this game. He understood that people like James were angry, and anger could be channeled. He understood that the real enemy, the economic system itself, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, was too complex and too systemic to fight directly. So he offered a simpler enemy, the other. The other wasn't the billionaire himself, or his billionaire donors, or his billionaire friends in the cabinet. The other was the immigrants taking jobs, the minority receiving special treatment, the liberal elite in the city who didn't understand the heartland, the wokeness that was supposedly destroying America. The populist billionaire became the shield for the very system he claimed to oppose. He offered the working class a target that felt achievable, a fight that felt winnable, a narrative that made their struggles feel less like the results of an unfair system and more like the result of a cultural war they could win. The deceased's gambit was the long-standing strategy of the wealthy elite to use cultural and social issues to divide the working class. By getting them to fight each other over race, religion, gender, sexuality, and values, the rich could avoid a unified front demanding economic justice. The populist billionaire perfected this strategy. He combined economic populism promising to bring back jobs, to fight for the forgotten with social conservatism and cultural nationalism promising, to defend traditional values, to build walls, to deport the other. He offered the working class a sense of identity, of belonging, of purpose, while ensuring that the actual economic policies favored the wealthy. The con was complete. The working class voted for someone who promised to fight for them, but who delivered policies that primarily benefited the rich. They voted for someone who promised to drain the swamp, but who filled it with his own cronies. They voted for someone who promised to fight the establishment, but who became the establishment. They voted for someone who promised to represent their interests, but who represented the interests of his own class. The billionaire class, the very class they thought they were fighting against. The factory closure was just the beginning for James. After the initial shock wore off, the practical problems set in. The severance pay ran out. The unemployment benefits, while helpful, didn't cover his full expenses. The mortgage on his modest house became a monthly struggle. The car payment, the insurance, the groceries, everything felt more expensive, more difficult. He applied for other jobs, but the factory jobs were gone. The new jobs in his area were often part-time, with no benefits, paying less than his factory wage. He took what he could find, often 2 or 3 part-time jobs, stringing together a living that left him exhausted and with no time for his family. The healthcare was a nightmare. His factory insurance was gone. The Sue Goldberg plan was too expensive. He and his wife went without insurance, crossing their fingers and hoping for the best. When his daughter got sick, they paid out of pocket. When his back went out from the new jobs, he couldn't afford to see a doctor. The American healthcare system, already a burden for many, became a crushing weight for James and his family. The political promises he had heard, the promises of the populist billionaire, seemed increasingly hollow. The jobs that were supposedly coming back were often not the same jobs, not in the same places, not with the same pay and benefits. The draining of the swamp turned out to be filling it with new alligators. The fighting for the forgotten seemed to be fighting for a cultural identity that felt increasingly under threat, while the economic realities that had created the feeling of being forgotten remained unchanged. The tax cuts, when they came, were primarily for corporations and the wealthy. James saw little direct benefit. The regulations they wanted to cut were often the ones protecting the environment, financial markets, and workers. The infrastructure projects they promised to fund were often delayed or mismanaged. The trade deals they renegotiated often hurt the very industries and workers they claimed to protect. James began to feel the weight of the con. He had voted for change, for someone who would fight for him. Instead, he felt more forgotten than ever. The economic pressures mounted. The political promises rang hollow. The cultural battles, while energizing for some, felt like a distraction from the real problems. He was angry, but he was also confused. How had he been so wrong? How had he supported someone who seemed to represent everything he thought he was fighting against? Despite the mounting evidence, despite the policies that seemed to hurt him more than help him, James clung to the narrative, the alternative that he had been duped, that the system had worked exactly as intended to get him to vote against his own interests was too painful to accept. So he found reasons. The other guy was the problem. The mainstream media was lying. The economy was complex, and the benefits of the policies would take time to trickle down. It wasn't the fault of the leader he had supported. It was the fault of the deep state, the establishment Republicans, the fake news. This leap of faith, this refusal to acknowledge the con, was perhaps the most crucial part of the scam. The populist billionaire had created such a strong emotional bond with his supporters, such a sense of shared identity and shared grievance, that questioning the leader was tantamount to questioning themselves. To admit that the leader was a fraud was to admit that they had been foolish, naive, easily manipulated. It was easier to double down, to find new reasons to support, to blame new enemies, than to confront the uncomfortable truth. James's faith became a form of self-protection. It allowed him to maintain his sense of identity, his sense of belonging to something larger than himself. It allowed him to avoid the crushing feeling of being powerless in a system designed to keep him powerless. He had invested emotionally in the narrative, and walking away from it would have meant walking away from a part of himself. The cognitive dissonance was immense. He supported policies that hurt him economically while believing they would help him. He supported a leader who was demonstrably wealthy while believing he was fighting for the working man. He supported a message of draining the swamp while the swamp filled with new occupants who looked remarkably similar to the old ones. He supported a message of fighting for America while the policies often seemed to benefit foreign allies or domestic elites more than ordinary Americans. But the narrative was too strong, the emotional investment too deep, the alternative too painful. So James and millions like him continued to believe. They continued to support. They continued to fight the other while the real enemy, the economic system itself, continued to work against them. The real inheritance James and his fellow supporters received wasn't the economic turnaround they were promised. It wasn't the return of good-paying factory jobs. It wasn't the reduction in healthcare costs or the improvement in infrastructure. It wasn't the draining of the swamp or the fighting for the forgotten. The real inheritance was division. It was the deepening of the cultural and political chasms that made it nearly impossible for working-class Americans, regardless of their specific grievances, to unite and demand economic justice. While James fought against wokeness, against immigrants, against liberal elites, the actual architects of his economic hardship, the tax code that favored the wealthy, the trade deals that prioritized corporate profits over American jobs, the corporate consolidation that reduced competition and suppressed wages, the financialization of the economy that shifted wealth from workers to capital kept operating, largely unchanged by the populist rhetoric. The policies implemented often benefited the very class the rhetoric claimed to oppose. The stock market continued to soar, driven by corporate tax cuts and deregulation. The wealthy continued to accumulate wealth at a faster pace than the rest of the population. The concentration of wealth and power at the top continued, even as the rhetoric promised to fight it. The populist billionaire had become a tool for the system he claimed to oppose, using the anger of the working class to justify policies that ultimately benefited the wealthy, while keeping the working class focused on cultural battles that offered no economic solutions. The revelation was that the populist billionaire wasn't an outsider fighting the system. He was a master manipulator who used the language of populism to serve the interests of the system. He was the ultimate con man, selling the working class a bill of goods that made them complicit in their own economic subjugation. He gave them a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, a sense of fighting back, while the actual fight was being fought on a different battlefield entirely, one where they were unwitting foot soldiers for the very forces they thought they were opposing. The twist of fate was that James, and millions like him, had become the very thing they thought they were fighting against. They had become the foot soldiers for the wealthy, the defenders of a system that was designed to keep them down. They had been convinced that the enemy was not the billionaire class, but the immigrant, the minority, the liberal elite. They had been convinced that the solution was not economic justice, but cultural warfare. The moral choice was stark. They could continue to fight the other, continue to support the leader who promised to fight for them, but delivered for the wealthy, continue to believe the narrative that kept them divided and powerless. Or they could acknowledge the con, confront the system, and demand real economic change. But acknowledging the con meant admitting they had been wrong, admitting they had been manipulated, admitting that the leader they had invested so much emotional energy in was not who he claimed to be. For many like James, the second option was too difficult. The first option, continuing the fight against the other, was easier. It preserved their identity, their sense of purpose, their belief that they were on the right side of history. It allowed them to avoid the crushing realization that they had been used, that their anger had been channeled into a fight that served the interests of their oppressors. The populist billionaire had won the ultimate victory. He had convinced the working class to fight for him, to defend him, to excuse his failures while he delivered for his own class. He had turned the victims of the system into its defenders, the forgotten into the forgotten who supported the powerful. He had made them complicit in their own economic subjugation while making them feel like heroes in a cultural war. The story of James and millions like him is a story of betrayal, not just by the populist billionaire, but by the system that allowed the con to happen. It's a story of how economic anxiety can be weaponized into cultural rage. It's a story of how the very people who are most hurt by an unfair system can be convinced to defend that system against their own interests. The resolution isn't a happy one. James likely continued to struggle economically, continued to vote for leaders who promised to fight for him, but delivered for the wealthy, continued to fight cultural battles that offered no economic solutions. The factory that closed might have stayed closed or been replaced by a low-wage job. The healthcare costs might have continued to rise. The feeling of being forgotten might have persisted even as he fought to defend the very system that had forgotten him. But the story also offers a moral. Real wealth, real power, real justice isn't found in the loudest voice or the most confident claim or the simplest answer. It's found in understanding the true nature of the system, in recognizing the difference between a con man who plays the part of the common man and an actual leader who fights for the common good. It's found in looking beyond the cultural distractions to the economic realities that shape our lives. The populist billionaire's promise was simple. He would fight for the forgotten. The reality was complex. he would use the forgotten to fight for the powerful. The smallest promise to fight for the working man carried the biggest lie that the system could be reformed without fundamentally changing who benefits from it. This story of James is a cautionary tale for anyone who feels forgotten, who feels angry, who feels like the system is rigged against them. It's a reminder that the loudest voice isn't always the one fighting for you, that the most confident claim isn't always the truest one, that the simplest answer isn't always the right one. It's a reminder that the real enemy might not be the other that the loudest voice is telling you to fight, but the system itself and the people who profit from keeping it unchanged. The moral is clear. Look beyond the rhetoric, beyond the cultural battles, beyond the simple answers. Look for leaders who propose real systemic change that benefits the many, not the few. Look for policies that address the root causes of economic inequality, not just the symptoms. Look for unity, not division. Look for truth, not the comfortable lies that make you feel like you're fighting for something when you're actually fighting for nothing. The story of James and the millions like him is a story that continues to unfold in American politics. It's a story of how the very people who need change the most can be convinced to oppose it. It's a story of how the loudest voice can drown out the wisest counsel. It's a story of how the promise of fighting for the forgotten can become the practice of using the forgotten to protect the powerful. And it's a story that hopefully more people will recognize before it's too late, before the con is complete, before the real inheritance, a system that works for the few at the expense of the many, becomes the only inheritance left to claim. The final lesson is perhaps the most important. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the working class that their enemy was not the billionaire who owned the factory, but the immigrant who wanted to work in it. The populist billionaire perfected this trick, playing the part of the champion of the forgotten while serving the interests of the powerful. The story of James is a reminder to always ask who benefits from the fight you're being asked to join, and whether the enemy you're being asked to fight is the real enemy at all.